Hello, and welcome to week 10 in behavior management, chapter 10, where we're going to be talking about shaping and chaining. Now, the reason why we have this chapter is because we recognize in behavior management that not all activities are simple. Some of the behaviors that we want to engage in or we want to teach somebody are complex, involving numerous parts and numerous steps, and we want to have the capacity to build all of that into a behaviorally oriented learning sequence using the ABC contingency theory. So we start to look at complex behaviors. It includes also the types of goals that we might have, that you may have, of accomplishing something. So if you were going to, let's say your exercise goal actually had an end goal of participating in a 10K. So I want to get in shape enough to go for a 10K. So you might even look up what are the milestones that you have to achieve in order to be ready to run in that 10K, let's say next summer. So you could divide that out into what do you need to accomplish each month, what do you need to accomplish each week, what do you need to accomplish each day. And you can break that down and put yourself on a pattern of behavior that would result in achieving a goal in the long run. This might be the way that you take on major course projects. You're going to do a research paper, so you might take that research paper, divide it into different pieces, schedule when you're going to do those pieces and work on them, and spread that out over time. So the same concepts that we're going to use to break down complex behaviors, such as brushing your teeth or doing the laundry or something like that, which we know has lots of steps, we can also use those same techniques to break down our goals. So if we have complex goals that have a lot of moving parts, we can break those down and use the same methodologies of rewards as a way to accomplish those goals, particularly when there's some pieces of a goal, let's say, that you're not really into. Maybe it involves going out and meeting with people or making contacts or particular types of exercises that you're not really into, and it'll be important to compartmentalize those and adjust the rewards for yourself in order for you to be able to accomplish that goal. So the first thing that we kind of talk about when we start breaking down things, if we look at taking a behavior, is simply, well, how far do we go? How do we break this down into each incremental piece? And it kind of depends on the developmental level of the individual. So if you're doing something like teaching somebody how to tie their shoes or whatever, you might look at each step. You cross over and then you loop around, and then kind of depending on your particular upbringing, I had to make a loop on one of them, wrap the other one around, and push the other loop through underneath the original loop. Some people make two loops and then they tie them together the same way they did the first tie, which actually kind of makes sense. It results in the same knot, but nonetheless, you want to break that down in a way that the person, the student, understand that this is part of the process of teaching itself, is to what degree do we break down the skill in order for people to be able to consume that and understand it in manageable chunks. If you look at the way this functions in the development of this course, how each chapter introduces particular aspects of gaining a set of skills at the end of this class that you can use and apply in your own life and the life of others. So break that down. In fact, good textbooks do a really good job of breaking down information into manageable pieces, and even the structure of a textbook, the chapters, and then the sections, and then the section numbers, and then all of that is ways to take this complex piece of information and break it down into consumable pieces, all of which should be reinforcing, right? So there's that task itself of looking at the task and breaking it down. This can sometimes be difficult if you've mastered the task and you're thinking, just brush your teeth, and you don't really think about the actual process of brushing your teeth until you have to teach somebody who's never brushed their teeth how to do it. Then wow, this is complex. I learned it, maybe somebody taught me the basics, and then I learned it by trial and error over time. Teaching tries to truncate that trial and error process into a shorter, brief time in order to get that skill. So, but how did I learn? Where did I learn to angle the toothbrush in a particular way? Over time, it's changed. It used to be up and down. Now it's circles and the different angles of the brushes. And of course, the toothbrushes are all like engineered now to do special things. And I have a toothbrush now that swirls around and it has the water pick built into it. I mean, very cool stuff. Toothbrushing is an art form. And so, but how you break that down into those pieces. When you know something, when you know how to do something really well, it is sometimes difficult to put yourself in the mindset of a person who's never done it. So practicing and establishing that skill is something you can do in this class. I'm going to be asking you to do that, but then also it's something you can kind of practice over time, and you get better and better at reducing things to their basic components. It also depends, of course, on the developmental level of someone. What do they know already? We'll get into that in just a little bit. So then as we're teaching, there's a whole process. You think about, let's take a step back for a little bit. And we think about the process of education. The process of education in this particular class is I give you material to read, to develop an understanding of particular concepts, and then I ask you to engage in conversations, answering questions, and putting assignments together to demonstrate your understanding of those things. The critical part is actually when I give you feedback, and it have to kind of loops around. So particularly in a class like this where there's just these videos that explain a little bit, but then you're mostly on your own to read my material, as clear as that is to you or as not clear as that is to you, maybe engaging in some questions to help you understand things, maybe looking things up to get another perspective. And then you do the assignment, whatever it is, and then you kind of wait. Did I get it right? Did I not? Maybe you feel confident about it. Maybe you don't feel confident about it, the kind of feelings. But that doesn't really resolve until I do my half of that. I go in, I put check marks on things, I provide you with verbal feedback, or sometimes I just say good job and I put 100 on it. That kind of thing. And that loop, that feedback mechanism that's coming back is an important part of the process of teaching a skill that has multiple steps. The degree to which we provide feedback and the frequency by which we provide feedback is a structure of the learning environment. In this particular learning environment, the role that I have for giving feedback is kind of what we would call maybe summative, meaning you do the whole thing on your own, and I'll give you feedback on the final product. I don't give you feedback as you go along. I assume a lot of the students in this class in terms of their capacity, your capacity to gain from reading and looking at the videos and looking at the examples, to be able to learn a lot of this on your own, to allow that process to happen independently, and I don't provide moment-to-moment feedback. That would not be the case if I was working with different populations or different kinds of skills. Sometimes you require an individual right there. But even then, if you've ever taught somebody a skill, there's always that sort of decision-making of, you come to a step in the process and like, do I or do I not provide feedback? Or do I let the person make a mistake, recognize it, and maybe self-correct, and somehow intuitively understand, and it's true, that that's a great way to learn. You don't always want somebody to just jump on you every time you're about to make a mistake or they know you're about to make a mistake. Sometimes you want to learn from those mistakes. Authors throughout history have always highlighted times in their lives when they have made mistakes and how important those experiences have been. But then again, if you're teaching somebody to shoot a gun, there's a certain time in which you want to intervene before certain mistakes would be made. So it's always a decision process as to how much feedback do you want to provide along the way. Now, in the context of a behavior management class, we're seeing that feedback, that interplay between the individual who's learning and the teacher as a constant dynamic communication process of providing positive feedback. And I'm gonna use the word, let's say, providing reinforcement. Let's get our language straight before I mess that up. Providing reinforcement, yes, that's the next step. Those kind of things. And then providing kind of a bit of a punishment. Are you sure you want to do that? Is that the next step? That's not the next step. And then maybe some more stimulus. Maybe you want to try this instead of what you were just about to do. This kind of nuanced communication, which is you could break it down into A, B's, and C's that are overlapping and happening all the time. We look at that when we look at transactional analysis, I believe, later in this class. You can take an entire conversation and you can see where stimulus happens, but the stimulus is also a reward or a punishment. And you can analyze arguments that way, looking at the ABC contingency theory. But it's a very dynamic, very almost intuitive way in which people establish this rapport with their students. You probably had great teachers who had that ability to stay right with you the moment, give you just enough information for you to be able to take the next step relatively independently. And I'm sure you've had some people that are like, just do this, then do that, because they don't want to teach you. They just want to get you out of the office. I've had a few IT people like that, actually. But at the same time, I've also enjoyed some very, very good IT professionals who are not only good with technology, but have a really good capacity to be able to patiently help someone through the process of using technology themselves. So when we correct, what do we do? Do we repeat the instructions? This is a list from the course book. Repeat the instructions, modify the instructions, maybe say them in a different way, maybe give a hint, maybe we reteach the actual task itself, reteach that step, do that. We could offer maybe a different way to solve the problem or a different way to think about things, expanding this into other areas that we might use this kind of teaching. We might use analogies to help somebody understand something that's complex, those kind of things. So you can see where I kind of brokered a transition in the use of these kinds of techniques when we're teaching typing versus something like that. And when we're actually engaged in psychotherapy, and yet it's all the same principles are at play. Now, the subtlety by which we redirect people, sort of summarized in a graphic that I have right at the beginning of the course book. See this right here. You have a basketball that rolls onto the court, and your job is to get it over to the exit. Now, I'm showing a pretty, varied sort of trajectory here to exemplify how varied the path could be between 2 points. Maybe this looks a lot like your career path. Maybe you started off in a direction, changed directions, wandered all over the place, and eventually you're going to find some career at the end. But the arrows represent points in time in which feedback is provided. in a particular direction. In this case, I use arrows to represent vectors of force. So the basketball is coming down right from the entryway. Push it a little bit that way, and it curves up a little too far. Push it back down, and then it's a little too far there. Push it back up. Maybe I did a lot of energy on that one, and kind of sent it over to the side, up to the top of the screen there. And you can see how all of the different ways in which feedback is provided to the basketball moving through this environment, eventually finding its way to its goal. Now that feedback might come internally as you wander around and like, that's not right, and then I'm going to move this way, and it could come externally. Either way, we're talking about complex behaviors that we set up providing feedback, and potentially within the behavior management model, providing reinforcers along the way. That is shaping. All that I've talked about. Chaining, probably the most concrete way in which we approach this in a behavior management context, involves doing things stepwise. In terms of you take a task and we outline the steps for it, and then we rely on the natural occurrences of feedback and reinforcement in order to guide the person from one step to the other. And two particular approaches have been developed for that. One is called forward chaining, and one is called backwards chaining. Now, I have dynamically used both of those, when the situation has modified itself in the moment. But it's, I was just checking my levels of the sound. I think I'm shouting. My levels on my computer are going all over the place. Let's say we look at this graphic here. We have the initial instructions and the person engages in step one. You can then provide feedback and say that was good. But also, what is also happening is the individual looks at what they've done and they see that it's right. And that consequence becomes the antecedent for the next. That becomes the stimulus, basically. So the initial antecedent is the instructions, the first step of the behavior. The visual reference becomes the antecedent or the stimulus that produces the second step, and the consequence of that produces the stimulus, now an antecedent for step 3, and then finally rewarding of the behavior. This is the philosophy of the chaining process. Now, the forward and backwardness of something has to do with at what point do you initiate the learning. So in forward chaining, we teach step 1, get through that, and then we help them finish the task. Then we teach step 1 and 2. Or maybe we teach, you start and just keep going until you run into trouble, and that's where we intervene. Kind of a neat way to assess how much of this do they know. Now, this is sometimes the best way to do things. However, there's a methodology called backward chaining, which is very interesting as well and can be a very powerful tool for teaching something. So instead of starting with that first step, you actually engage the person to help them do everything except the last step. And then you tell them what the last step is, and they do the last step, and the task is complete. The next time around, maybe you go all the way to the last 2 steps, and you can see we're slowly moving from the completion of the project backwards. You allow the person to attain each one of those things. The advantage of that one is the reward of completing the task happens every time. So if there's a tying of the shoes or cooking a meal or anything like that, the idea that they've done the last step and now the task is complete is always involved in that. And that can be a very powerful reinforcer. So we have forward and backwards chaining, all of which apply to the concept of breaking things down into small steps and using feedback and reinforcers to shape the behavior over time in order to accomplish a goal or learn a new skill. Now, for the quiz, and this is probably just as good as a discussion, really, maybe even a more fun discussion than a quiz for next time, but I'm asking you to recall instances in your life where poor feedback has led to frustration. I think we've already even talked about some of this. It come from a teacher, it come from your parents, it can come from anybody. When is poor error correction? Poor error correction, looking at the generic term, has led to frustration. Then, in a similar way as I'd have you did the job tool, I want you to break down a task, a different task, maybe a more complex task, and I want you to create yet another infographic, stepwise, in terms of how to complete that. Pick a task that maybe entails some pictures, very, very similar to the first job tool one that you looked at. I'm giving you another chance to kind of get to know that software, get to know how to use graphics and whatnot in order to create that, and break down a task into steps. Okay, maybe you could set a goal for yourself, and you're going to look at large. So those steps are big. Maybe each one of those steps can be broken down, but nonetheless, you can use this however you would like. I've actually had someone took this assignment and broke down the process by which they were going to address the final special assignment, which I thought was actually very clever. I thought it was interesting they would take this opportunity to create a visual plan as to how they were going to get the final done. So cool stuff. So that's it for this week. We just have the quiz and the assignment. There are no discussions this week, so that will not be a part of what you're doing this week. So engage in this. We actually have a really interesting topic next class. We're going to be talking about token economies, and those are really fun, how powerful those can be, and the purpose they serve in group environments especially. So we'll get to that next week. Have a great week. And there's no discussion, so we won't be having that kind of interaction. If you have any issues, of course, email me, get in touch with me, post into the course discussions, and have a great week and take much care.